Hey, Brad Clark here from Rigging Dojo. I wanted to do a quick, this is based on a conversation on Twitter about kind of Blender versus Maya's organizational settings, and hopefully this will just help both sides understand how this stuff works. So, and this is not fully comprehensive, this is just going to be a quick kind of one-to-one relationship of what Maya does and how it works and what I've been able to discover in Blender and what's still missing. So when we create an object in Maya, if I create an object, right, it comes in at the scene level, just like Blender. The difference is that Maya has objects that are made up of multiple things, and by default, we have this extra input information to change things and do these settings. Now, if I wanted to organize this scene, if I create another, if I duplicate this and I move it over, and I create another one and I move it over, you can see that all these objects have transform values. They've been moved around the scene. Each object has a pivot point that can be moved and adjusted, and of course behind the scenes this is doing stuff to the mesh and all kinds of things, but for the most part it's just a empty node with a mesh attached to it. Okay, so right now I have three objects. If I wanted to organize these into a something to keep track of them, I could create a display layer. I'd add the layer, I could call this sphere, save it. I can hide the selection, the group of things. I can template them. I can change colors, and this is one way to organize it. I can select objects from here. Select objects. This has done nothing to the hierarchy. It's just purely a layer. Now, if I turn off tag objects, you can see that Maya has a bunch of other information in here that I cannot manipulate or parent, right? These are just simply nodes that exist in the scene and are settings to access through the attribute editor. Now, if I wanted to parent these objects inside of Maya to each other, I could certainly go do that, and I can select these nodes and parent, and select this and parent, and now I've created a hierarchy of 3 nodes. Now, I do this because for some reason I want to make this top node be the master of all this stuff and basically be, for all intents and purposes, this is the transform space that all of these other nodes live in. Now, they still exist in this group, in this visibility layer, but this is the master of the group. So if I scale it, everything scales. If I turn the visibility off, that visibility inherits down. And again, this is something that Maya does, but being able to selectively change visibility without the hierarchy is not Maya's jam easily. But the idea is here I've got a hierarchy of organization that is independent of my layer. Now, let's say that I create something like another object. Create like a locator, right, an empty in Blender. And I create a couple of these, and you can see that I've got all of these separate things plus this. Now, I could certainly, for organizational sake, simply create another node. If I create a null, all this means is I've done Control-G to create an empty group, or an empty. It just doesn't have a shape. It doesn't have a child information. So when you see a null in Maya or just an empty group, what this means is that it's just a transform in space, and it doesn't have any associated object properties like a way to draw a mesh. All right, so for all intents and purposes, it's just another locator. It's just another empty in the world. So I could certainly put all of these things. I could take this and organize it this way underneath this node, just like another parent-child relationship, but I don't want to do that. I want to organize this by some other way, regardless of hierarchy. So I can make a set. I can create a set, and in this set is a collection of all the nodes. Doesn't matter, it's independent of the hierarchy. This is just a collection. The set has a list of what's in it. I can select those things that are in it, and I can organize other things. If I turn off these, I can put other nodes into this set that are selectable. Now, these two things are still separate ideas, right? A set is just a way to select objects independent of hierarchy. This is just another way to collect and organize them independent of hierarchy. The problem is I can't have one object in two layers very easily. So I have sets. I can have just a set of locators, create a set, and so now I have my locators, and I have these two sets. If I bring up the attributes, they don't have any information. It's just a collection of nodes. Okay. Now, you can make them exclusive. You can do some other things, but it's still not the same as like a Blender collection, right? So if I go to Blender and we create the same objects, right? I go ahead and add mesh, and I create a UV sphere, and I duplicate it. So now we have, just like Maya, we have the scene level, we have several spheres, and if I were to parent this, now I grab the sphere and I translate it, it's the same as Maya, right? I've got all of this information is the same. Now, if I wanted to create some empties, just like Maya, I add my empty, and we'll do plain axis because that's basically a locator, and I duplicate it a few times, and I select all of this. I can add it to a new collection. New. Rig, whatever I want to call it. I can add the objects to it somehow. Move to, right, so I hit M, move to rig collection, and so now they're in this collection. Now if I wanted to create another collection from just the locators, I could do a new collection, or I could say move to a new collection, and that moves them out of that node. But I know that you can have them in several collections. So this kind of creates a different, this is more like layers, but I do believe you can have them exist in other collections. Still not completely familiar with Blender, but you know, I'm trying to get the idea. So then you have this ability to create these layers, much like Maya's visibility layers, and that's one way to organize it, right? So now let me jump back to Maya and show where this starts to become really cumbersome in Blender versus how to work with stuff in Maya. So I can easily come back to Maya, and in this hierarchy, if I decide to go down to the bottom sphere, and I want to parent it, I want to create a new relationship between these two nodes. I want a separator. I want a new empty that exists here. I can just do Control-G or group. Now I know group means something very different in Blender, but as far as Maya is concerned, it's a hierarchy operation. There are options to control where the selected object goes and where the new node that gets created exists, and whether or not you preserve position or keep the offset. So by default, we have a group that origin and group it under the parent. So when I hit group, you can see that it's created a new empty node, and this empty node is in the same location as the parent. So this new node gets inserted between the two selected objects, and its pivot point defaults to the parent's location. And now this object has a new parent. And we can do all kinds of things to it because it's just another transform, it's just a hierarchy. If I decide that I want all of these things to be in a new group, I can select all three of them, Control G, and it unparents all of them and creates a new relationship underneath this pivot, this node. This is just an empty. That's it. So if I group this, and then I group this, I group that, you can see that I'm just creating a nested hierarchy of organization or reasons to animate something, or offsets, transforms, whatever you want to think about it. That's all it's doing. If I wanted to do this exact same thing inside of Blender, there currently isn't a good solution for this. There is a add-on. So if we go to Preferences, and we go to Add-ons, and we go to Extras. Okay. Then if I select this object, and I go to Mesh, Add, Parent to Empty, it creates an empty node that exists in the world, but it didn't actually parent it to anything because this object was already in hierarchy. So I would have to first unparent, Control P, unparent, keep transform. So now this object should be unparented, but it didn't actually unparent for some reason. I said parent, Alt P, clear parent and keep transformation. Okay, so now this object has been unparented. I can go ahead and align these two objects. So I could do add, or actually transform, and transform, align objects, and relative to selection. Positive side. Yeah, alright. I'm not sure how to quite use the align tool, but I guess I could snap it as well. So if I snap this and tell the snap to be volume. I guess. Alright, well, close enough. So that's my new location. Now I need to go and parent the sphere to the empty, but it's objects. Yeah, so sphere here. So now I can parent this back under this, and then I would need to parent it back to my other original sphere. Control P, keep transform. Actually, I need this selected, then this Control P, keep transform. Okay, so now I'm back to having my hierarchy as expected, and I have my new transform node that exists above my sphere to do whatever I want with. As you can see, this operation to just simply insert a new parent node between the existing hierarchy and have it choose where to create it, if it's centered in the object or centered at the world or whatever other settings there are, is pretty clunky. So I found an add-on that is currently not updated to work completely in Blender 2.8, but it's the add transform. So now if I select the same node and I hit P, actually I broke the script, so never mind. Yeah, so now if I hit P, add parent, and I tell it to do at active position, I can create, let's go back to general. Okay, so now it creates a node that is parented, but you can see that this one doesn't quite work because it doesn't take into account that the object has another parent. It'll unparent whatever you have selected and put it under this new node, but it doesn't insert between selected hierarchies. Again, if we go back to Maya, I can select any node in here and group it, and it will insert it correctly within the space of this hierarchy. If I select 3 of these things and group, which basically just means reparent all of them under this new node, that's what it does. I can select them and hit unparent very easily, and by default it keeps the offset, so it keeps the transform, so I don't have to do that as an added selection. And then what was brought up about Blender and rigging is what if you have other constraints, right? This is a poor way to organize your scene, and correct, that is it's not a great way to organize things. So now if we add something like a constraint, right? When I create a constraint, let me switch to rigging. When I create a constraint, the constraint gets connected and it creates a new node that gets put in the hierarchy for organization. This node is not the actual constraint, it's just a transform that holds information about it. So it's a way to store attributes on the constraint, but I can unparent it. It can live in a group. It doesn't have to stay in a hierarchy. This thing doesn't exist for anything more than just selecting and getting the properties. Behind the scenes, Maya has the constraint, and it's actually got connections between the 2 objects. And for Blender, this would be the same as going to the modifier stack and seeing the constraint information. If we go back to Blender and I create a constraint, the constraint lives on the object, and let's see, copy location, and then I pick a target, right? So this constraint doesn't seem to show up in the hierarchy, right? Because that would be a Maya type thing, but the constraint information lives on the object, sphere 1. And maybe there's a way to show information, but this is really not the same. Indirect, no. Okay, so you can collection, yeah. So the constraints kind of stay on the object, and this is very much like Studio Max. So if you create constraints in Max, Max's information is on the object itself, and it doesn't create this weird like combined mess that is half constraint living in the hierarchy and half node objects and all this connection stuff. But just understand though that now I have the constraint in the hierarchy that is its own deal, but I also have the actual constraint node. And if I created math nodes, plus minus average, and anything else, now I have a lot of stuff that I need to organize that doesn't exist anywhere else in Maya. And that's where this idea of assets or containers comes from. So we can now create a group of nodes that are assets. An asset is a collection that can include the hierarchy, include shaders, include materials. It can have transforms or not, but if you just create it without a transform, then it's very much like a combination between a set over here and a visibility layer, and it allows you to organize and collect all of this information that is kind of hidden behind the scenes, something that you wouldn't see in the scene level. So Okay, so now we have this collection of nodes, and you can see that the constraint is in there and the spheres, and it's organized it in a way that is a system separate from the layers, separate from the sets. It has some sort of connection. It has a relationship. It has the ability to have other things done to it, right? So this is, if you combine the three ideas, you'd probably get to a similar version of what Blender assets are. But when it comes to basic transformation of objects and hierarchy and manipulation, Maya and Blender are not that far apart. The difference is Blender does not have a functional way to easily organize a hierarchy of objects and group them.